بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على خاتم الأنبياء وسيد المرسلين نبينا وحبيبنا محمد وعلى آله وصحابته أجمعين. اللهم علمنا ما ينفعنا وانفعنا بما علمتنا وزدنا علما. اللهم زدنا ولا تنقصنا وأكرمنا ولا تهنا وأعطنا ولا تحرمنا وآثرنا ولا تؤثر علينا وارض عنا. اللهم إنا نسألك خير هذا اليوم فتحه ونصره ونوره وبركته وهداه، ونعوذ بك من شره وشر ما فيه وشر ما قبله وشر ما بعده، ولا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله العلي العظيم. سبحانك لا علم لنا إلا ما علمتنا إنك أنت العليم الحكيم. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah wa barakatuh. And welcome back to the continuation of our Living Links program here at Zaytuna College. Welcome both to our students and also for those of you who are following online. We intend during this particular semester to complete the study of what we begun during the fall semester of this text entitled the Nazm of Waraqat, it is a text related to the subject of Islamic foundational jurisprudence, or we would say the foundations of Islamic jurisprudence. And the title of the course, as a reminder, is The Roots of Interpretative Disagreements, the Roots of Interpretative Disagreements, which is a direct translation of Usul Al-Fiqh, the foundations of Al-Fiqh, which jurisprudence, and jurisprudence itself being speculative by nature automatically leads to disagreement among scholars themselves, because when we distinguish Al-Fiqh or jurisprudence from what we call Sharia, the Islamic revealed law, then that in itself is one area, a way to sort of differentiate between the two. That is, if we do not include fiqh as part of the Sharia by extension, since it itself is derived from the Sharia in terms of at least the understanding of different peoples. Before proceeding, I do want to sort of review a little bit of what we have covered so far. First and foremost is to speak about the definition, once again, of Usul al-Fiqh, the foundations of Islamic jurisprudence, which, according to some, is ma'rifatu dalail al-fiqh al-ijmaliyya wa kayfiyat istifadati minha wa hal al-mustafid, is the knowledge of the non or unspecified proofs of Islamic jurisprudence, the ways of deriving benefit from those proofs, and the state of the person seeking benefit from them. Which would mean that there are three main topics or pivotal topics that are discussed in Usul al-Fiqh. One is what we call the proofs of Islamic jurisprudence, which includes in particular we're talking about what we call the sources of Islam, the masadr, like the Quran, the Sunnah, Ijmaa, Qiyas, مصالح مرسلة, استحسان, شرع من قبلنا, العرف, قول Sahabi, سد الذراع, and so these are fundamentally what we're referring to, and also istishab, the principle of al-istishab. So this is discussed first and foremost, well, at least is advised by many scholars to begin with the discussion of the sources of Islam, even though this particular text written by the Shafi'i scholar Sharafuddin or Nuruddin al-Amriti, which is based off of the original text of Imam al-Haramain al-Juwayni, rahmatullah alayhima, which is called al-Warqat, a perennial text studied for centuries in the Muslim world, and as an introduction to this particular science. And so to begin, one pivotal aspect of the study is the study of the sources of Islamic law. And in the study of the sources of Islamic law, one is speaking or trying to study, first and foremost, what is it that makes those sources authoritative? What makes the Quran authoritative? What makes the Sunnah authoritative? The Ijmaa, Qiyas. So the definition of those sciences, the disagreement about the definition even, or aspects of those particular sources which may or may not be considered to be as authoritative as other aspects of those sources. And then the second most pivotal topic is what we call al-mabahith al-lughawiyya, the linguistic areas of study, because of course while we are engaging in the textual sources of Quran and Sunnah, it is important for us to understand first and foremost that the Islamic law is fundamentally in Arabic. If we say not only fundamentally but entirely, it is in Arabic. The Sharia is Arabiya, and that is to say that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala revealed the Quran in the Arabic language, and the Prophet himself, ﷺ, spoke the Arabic language, and that in itself necessitates that one has a thorough knowledge of the Arabic language in its constructs and its nuances. And for this reason, in this particular text, both in the poem and in the original work of Imam al-Juwayni, actually begins by speaking about the values or the moral values of Islam, or for the legal judgments of Islam, and then moves into issues related to epistemology, and then eventually works his way up to language and parts of speech, what is a complete sentence. There are different types of words and uses of different expressions. Some uses are figurative, some uses are literal, and then eventually he transitions into a discussion of the prophetic actions, and is an indirect way of saying the Sunnah. He doesn't have a chapter called the chapter of the Sunnah as a source of Islamic law, but rather he just simply begins Bab al-Af'al, the chapter of actions, and really what he means by the actions of the Prophet ﷺ. And so in studying the actions of the Prophet, we learn, what type of actions what type of actions have legislative import. Are we to emulate the Prophet in everything, or are there certain things that are strictly, they strictly originate from his bashariya, or his sort of humanity, which we have no obligation to necessarily follow him in? And then were there other areas which are devotional, and we are said that we should follow him in terms of those issues. So he deals with this matter. There's also no chapter called the chapter of the Quran, but he has a chapter called the chapter of abrogation, Bab al-Nasakh. And so we dealt with abrogation and the idea that certain Quranic verses can cancel out the meaning or the ruling of certain other Quranic verses. So there are a lot of theory, a lot of disagreement among scholars about just how many verses in the Quran may have been abrogated by other verses, and the different types of abrogation. And so there's a lot of disagreement there, and we dealt with those issues. But the very concept itself is something which has to be acknowledged, cannot be denied, because there are enough verses in the Quran itself that indicate that abrogation does occur, even if we disagree about the number of verses which have been abrogated. Or when we say abrogated, the verses being abrogated, meaning that the particular ruling which had been prescribed was abrogated or canceled out by a later ruling which was prescribed. And so these knowing the sources are important, but then also knowing how to interpret the sources extremely important. And to sort of give some context to this as well, this particular science, because it is a very philosophical, in some regards, science, as we can see, and it can be intimidating for a lot of people for them to study something on this level. Typically, in the Islamic world, historically, students, before they would study Usul al-Fiqh, they would study a significant amount of fiqh for a number of years. And then after a number of years of study in fiqh or jurisprudence, then they would study usul al-fiqh, so that way it was easier for them to engage the topic. And so this often is one of the basic reasons that many people found it difficult to follow. However, it is an indispensable topic of study. If anything, the scholars, when they speak about the disciplines of Islam, they say that there are two meta-disciplines in Islam. One is called Usul which is typically described or translated as theology. and the other is Usul al-Fiqh, which is this one, which is the foundations of Islamic jurisprudence. So these being two meta-disciplines itself can be problematic for some because, in the Western tradition, the true meta-discipline, the master of all disciplines is philosophy, and the philosophy itself is a rational discipline. It is somewhat, you can say, sort of centers upon man, or is concerned mainly with rationality in human terms, and so what things that result from that particular discipline has, of course, many different applicabilities. However, in the religious context, for Muslims, theology is the true meta-discipline because God is the center of our universe, of our worldview, and so we acknowledge that reason has limits, and so there is understanding beyond human reason, and certain things we cannot discern by simply thinking and using logical deduction, among other things. So theology becomes the true discipline, the true meta-discipline, in that it is a goal. It is the true goal of all of our studies. Whereas Usul al-Fiqh is what we call a tool discipline. It's because scholars like Ibn Khaldun, they define the sciences, the Islamic sciences, into what we call al-ulum al-aliyah wa al-ulum al-gha'iyah, the tool sciences and then the goal sciences. So theology is a type of knowledge that we truly seek to grasp and unlock, and because it's the source of our salvation in this world and in the next. But Usul al-Fiqh is a science which it acts in the service of the Sharia. It helps us to better discern what we would believe to be the intent of God. Now, of course, after the death of the Prophet, ﷺ, the Sahaba themselves were left with a lot of trouble in trying to discern what God's intent was. And then, of course, that became even more exacerbated as time went on. Those civil wars, the time of the Tabi'een comes in, the successor generation, and eventually scholars felt a need to develop a way to try to preserve the Islamic teachings, or the teachings of truth. The period of Abu Bakr as-Siddiq during his reign, the challenge was to bring together the pages of the Quran into one book because of the fear that the knowledge of the Quran would be lost through the death of the Qurra who were killed in the Battle of Yamama, or many of them, 70 of them, were killed in the Battle of Yamama against the false prophet Musaylima. And so Umar ibn Khattab, he came and he pleaded with Abu Bakr that he should have the pages of the Quran brought together. And the Prophet didn't tell him to do that, and Abu Bakr, he was uneasy about it at first, but Umar convinced him. So that in itself was, the goal was for them to preserve the teachings of God. But then up to 100 years later, Sahaba and Tabi'een were still confused about whether or not it was okay to actually record the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, because there's a hadith which has been related wherein he is said to have said, "La taktubu anni," do not write anything from me, do not record anything from me. وَمَنْ كَتَبَ عَنِّي غَيْرَ الْقُرْآنِ فَيَمْحُ, and whoever records from me anything other than the Quran, then let him erase it. And so going almost a century, or well into the century, the start of the second century, this was still a matter of confusion. And then eventually Muslims, they decided that the only reason that the Prophet ﷺ wanted them to not record his sayings was that there was a fear that they would be mixed up with the words of God. At least because the statement itself was transmitted without a context, and so they tried to give it context, and so they felt that particular rationale was sufficient, and so then a campaign began. And so, of course, now the campaign was about what? It's about the fear of losing knowledge of the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ. You see, and because many different heresies have erupted or had arisen by this time. And a number of the scholars concerned that as more and more generations go by, we don't know how much of the truth of Islam will be preserved for the future generations. So they decided we need to develop sciences like the science of hadith for authentication of reports, but also this science we call fiqh, Usul al-Fiqh, which helps us to be guided by certain parameters or guidelines that have been inspired by the Quran and by the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ, because of the belief that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, as is stated over and over in the Quran, that Allah has a Sunnah. He has his own way of acting and interacting with the creation. And he talks about how that Sunnah does not change. And so if that is the case, they feel, okay, if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, this is what he says of himself, and he is given a judgment, then that judgment has to follow a certain type of logic, you see. And so we will try to extract that logic and build a sort of a science which helps us to be guided by it into the future, so to ensure that at least, even though we can't say for certainty that this is what Allah says about something, but we say this is most likely what God probably has to say about the issue. So this is, again, philosophical, very philosophical, but extremely important. Especially important because although we have a tendency to incline towards the wisdom tradition, where we are concerned more so about the particular wisdoms that originate from the statements of people of the past, of wise people of the past, and we feel good when we hear nice stories about people and the great things that happened to them and the different things that they said. However, at a certain point, you have to ask the question of, well, did that person truly ever say that? We have to be concerned about authenticity as well. So a good story is fine, but at the end of the day, the attribution has to be an authentic attribution before we say that this is something that the Prophet said or someone else. So this is why this particular science is so important. So people should not sort of belittle it, because in belittling this science, you're belittling the deen, the religion itself altogether, because it's one of the two meta disciplines. Now, and then finally, before going into the text once again, if we try to contextualize this particular discipline or this science for what's happening in the world today, when we look at, for instance, the attacks on the Prophet ﷺ, the very fact that the lives of Muslims in certain countries, like in Paris in particular, it's become very difficult for them to live there, and there have been reports of attacks on not only adults but on children in that country because of the murders of these reporters who had did these cartoons, or they were defaming or demeaning, disparaging the Prophet ﷺ. And of course, all the Muslims have been sort of blamed for this because of the actions of a few, apparently, and so often we may wonder, well, why would people react in that way? Why would people, one, be forced to kill others because they feel that they offended the Prophet ﷺ, among other things? The other reasons that they given, it wasn't just simply because of that, because there's a lot of a history of imperialism, among other things, and economic suppression, which have led to people's imbalance and lead them to do some very outrageous things at times. So understanding that psyche, but also understanding the psyche of those who will go and attack others who are not directly responsible for those different things. Usul al-Fiqh is one of those sciences that helps us to try to contextualize those issues, because epistemology is extremely important. Then we start talking about the worldview of different people that you find in the West, that people they get, what's wrong with these Muslims? Why they get so offended when people speak about their religion. We speak about Christians all the time, we speak about Buddhists, and we speak about these other people all the time, and they don't react that way. Why do Muslims react this way? Why are they so sensitive? They need to get caught up with the world, and they realize that, all that backwards thinking, is people have transcended it, they move beyond it. And I mean, it was once said that there was a clash of civilization between the West and the Islamic world. Rather, there's a clash of the uncivilized, but also there's a clash of values. There is definitely a clash of values. And what people don't understand is that in the Muslim world, religion, Islam, is the source of their values, is their value system. In the West, religion is not the source of many of their sort of thinking. Like nationalism is more important than religion, So a person, they'll burn a Bible and people won't make a big deal out of it. They burn the American flag, people are in uproar, you see. Why? Because it is a state religion, So it's a different, so when you understand, where people, their thinking originates from, and then the Europeans, religion failed them, you see. But there is assumption often that since it failed them, then religion can't possibly have any value to anyone else either, So Islam was not Christianity, in their context, but they're assuming that if it didn't work for us, it can't possibly work for anybody else. So we have to fight against any sort of religious type of thinking, you see. So everything has a context, and this helps us to do that. And so what we learned before, when we reflect upon some of the reasons for a difference of interpretation of issues, that in particular, if we talk about the scripture, we had learned that one reason has to do with the fact that scholars may, for one, not just not know that certain information exists, in the Sunnah, in the Quran itself, and so their assumptions are based upon their own personal reasoning. It could be as well that they are aware that those things exist, but they believe, for one, that the Prophet ﷺ didn't say it, for instance. So one group says, well, the Prophet said it, another group, the Prophet didn't say that. So some, like for instance, a lot of people believe that the Prophet ﷺ didn't have a shadow, or the Prophet ﷺ that everything is created from his light. That is some hadiths, even though most of the hadith scholars say that they're fabricated, but people believe that, and so it's based upon their beliefs in those hadiths, and others say, well, no, the Prophet didn't say it because they're considered to be fabricated. So they don't believe in the idea that the Prophet didn't have a shadow, among other things. So sometimes it's because of that. I don't believe that the Prophet ﷺ said that, or maybe I believe that the Prophet ﷺ said it, but his words are ambiguous. And so this is why we learn about the difference between general expressions, expressions which are sort of specific, the absolute, those were qualified, among other things. So the Prophet, the words are ambiguous, and this happens as well, that one person interprets it or understands it one way and the other person understands it in a different way. And then sometimes it's because you believe that a particular ruling is abrogated, that one injunction or prescription that was mentioned early in Islamic history was later overridden by another prescription. So that may be the sources of the disagreement, whereas another person will say, well, no, there's no abrogation. Rather, this is an example of takhsis of the am, or specification of a general injunction, and so those are some of the reasons. And so today, what we plan to speak about is the concept of ijma', which is also another source of disagreement amongst Muslims, and it could be the source, of course, not only amongst Muslims but non-Muslims as well. If you understand, for instance, if you look at this as sort of like political parties, that they have their own reasons for being at odds with one another, the Republicans or the Democrats or the Tea Party, among others, that people have their sort of philosophies which undergirds their particular movements. They have their dogma that sort of guides them. And so either you're pro-life or you're pro-choice, right? Pro-life, pro-choice, pro-life. So the way that they sort of deal with things, like abortion, so people have their ways that they frame things, and their own epistemology, their own sort of philosophy guides their ideas. Now, ijma' it translates as consensus. Ijma', consensus. The chapter concerning consensus in this particular work. And consensus, by saying that it is a source of disagreement amongst Muslims, I say that because there often you'll find that some who would claim consensus has occurred on something, and others say no, it has not occurred on an issue. Or it may be that one group believes that the doctrine of consensus is authoritative, and another group says, well, no, there's no such thing as consensus. Like the Shi'a, for instance, they don't believe in the doctrine of consensus. With the Sunnis, they believe in the doctrine of consensus. And the Shi'a would say, well, the reason that Sunnis made this up was so to try to make it seem like we were wrong, that they just sort of just made up this thing to try to corner us, especially those who go as far as say that if you go against the consensus, that you're not a Muslim. And if you're not a Muslim, you're an apostate. And if you're apostate, you can be killed, right? As a sort of like a way of, some people utilize as a source of intellectual terrorism, so it's like, you better be quiet and accept what I say or we're going to kill you, you see. And it has been utilized that way as well historically. So that is, and this comes up like as well. I mean, with some of the more mundane issues we deal with in society. Like for instance, some of the great tragedies that have occurred. There are conspiracy theories about many different things in society, and then there's official versions of those issues, and then there are the conspiracy theories about them, and so the conspirators often are like made to feel uneasy, or they're made out to look crazy, among other things. You see, even if they come forth with a lot of evidence to support their claims, because it's like this, the agreement of the majority becomes authoritative, you see, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it is the truth, but it's just simply what people have come to accept. So the working definition of Ijmaa is اتفاق جميع المجتهدين من المسلمين في عهد من العصور عصر من عصور بعد وفاة الرسول على حكم شرعي في واقعة. At least that's the way that Sheikh Abdul Wahab Khalaf defines it. It is the agreement, the unanimous agreement of all of the Mujtahideen, the scholars qualified to do ijtihad. So all the Mujtahideen from the Muslims in one age and any age happening after the age of the Prophet upon a judgment of the sacred law related to an occurrence, as opposed to related to a matter of reason, because there's no ijma', la ijma' fil aqliyat. You can't claim consensus in matters, in rational issues, even though many people try to do that, you see, or a matter of theology, just like ijma', you can't believe anything else, I mean, ijma' in this sense, of course, we have our teachings that we have as Muslims, but it's like certain issues are speculative that they arrived at on the basis of speculation that people made about them, and then some people will say, well, you have to believe, and if you don't, that's a problem. At any rate, Imam Amriti, he says, اتفاق كل أهل العصر أي علماء الفقه دون نكر. The agreement among all the people of the age, that is the scholars of jurisprudence, without the possibility of dissension. على اعتبار حكم أمر قد حدث شرعا كحرمة الصلاة بالحدث, or on consideration of a decree occurring in relation to the Sharia, like the prohibition of prayers in a state of pollution. احتج بالإجماع من ذي الأمة لا غيرها إذ خصصت بالعصمة. One may have recourse as a proof of consensus, as a proof of anyone within the ummah, not outside of it, because this ummah collectively has been given protection against error. So anyway, we return back to this. So the first thing is that the agreement among all the people of the age, the اتفاق كل أهل العصر, that the agreement of all the people of a single age, meaning the Mujtahideen, at least for Imam Juwayni, is what we call consensus. So a generation happens, a new issue comes up that didn't exist during the period of the revelation of the Quran, and the scholars, they deliberate over it individually. Each individual scholar, he exerts his effort to try to arrive at the truth. He then comes out, or she comes out, and expresses or declares their particular position on the issue. Others do the same, presumably without being influenced by other people's views. And then if it happens that all of their views coincide, all of the judgments, each judgment which is given coincides with one another, and they are all the same, we call that a consensus. And when that occurs, according to the majoritarian doctrine, then that ruling now becomes a new teaching of Islam, that it so if it may have not been understood during the previous generation, but the current generation, it becomes a teaching of Islam, a part of the religion itself, and it's binding upon the generations after them to accept those things as being part of Islam. And so then he makes a distinction as well. He said that the scholars of jurisprudence, so the agreement among all the people of the age, that is the scholars of jurisprudence. That's because the view of most of the scholars is that only the opinion of the scholars is given consideration. Now, there are many scholars as well. There's some scholars actually say, no, even the commoners, so the ittifaq of all the Muslims, both the scholars and unscholars. And then that, of course, is a minority opinion, but it does exist. But it lets you know that the definition of ijma' itself, there's actually no ijma' on the definition of ijma'. There's no consensus on the definition of consensus, or what constitutes a consensus to start from the very beginning. But most of the scholars say that consensus it can only occur on the basis of the views of the scholars themselves. And he says without the possibility of dissension, meaning that once ijma' occurs, la yajuzu mukhalafatuhu, that it is not permissible to contravene it. Wa mukhalifu lahu kafir, and this is what the ulama say. And the person who goes against it's a non-Muslim. You're an apostate, right? And so ijma', there are two different types of ijma'. There's what's called ijma' as-sukuti, which is implicit consensus. And in this case, this is when some scholars come out and they express their view on the issue, and while the others remain silent, right? But with the knowledge that others have expressed their views. And so this is an implicit consensus. So the scholars say that this type of consensus is not binding in the sense that or let's say it's not a hujjah, it's not a authoritative type of consensus such that if a person goes against it, that he or she will no longer be a Muslim. But the other type of consensus is called al-ijma' as-sarih or ijma' al-qat'i, explicit ijma', explicit consensus. And this is a case when every mujtahid in a particular generation, they come out and express their views on the issue, and then those views all coincide with one another, and then once that occurs, that no one can contravene it. And if a person contravenes it according to the Sunni doctrine of Ijma', they say that you are not a Muslim if you go against it. Now, of course, the Shi'a is like, well, listen, we don't even, it doesn't exist. We don't accept Ijma' to even start with. So anything that you guys say has no binding sort of effect on us. You see, So, but this is what the Sunnis say about that issue. But then the question becomes next is like, well, if this is the way that we understand Ijma', has Ijma' actually ever occurred? And this is a question that scholars have asked from generations ago, centuries ago. Like Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal radiallahu anh actually is reported to have said, "Man idda'a al-ijma'a fahuwa kadhab." Whoever claims ijma' is a liar. Whoever claims consensus is a liar, because their view is that there are too many scholars and it's impossible for you to ascertain the view of every single mujtahid in the world at any given time. So if anyone says or claims that ijma' has occurred, is a liar. And so he said that, rather you should say, la a'rifu fihi khilafan, rather you should say that I don't know of any disagreement about the issue. You should say that. Because don't say that ijma'. Now he believed in the theoretical possibility of ijma', but he objected to the claim itself that it actually has occurred, you see, according to this particular definition. And this particular understanding is shared by many of our scholars, that ijma' has never, according to the definition of the scholars of Usul al-Fiqh, ijma' has never occurred, right, according to this definition. That is to say, there's never been an age where all of the mujtahids of a particular generation have come out and have expressed an opinion about something, and we are able to retain and ascertain those opinions and put them together, and then to speak with certainty that this is what Islam, or this is what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has revealed through the community itself. Because, and that's another issue which is extremely important, that the question of the isma of the Prophet ﷺ, the divine protection, the infallibility of the Prophet ﷺ, that who does it, or how does it transfer to anyone after his death? You see, now for the Sunnis, the Isma was transferred to the community itself, to the Jama'ah itself. لا تجتمع أمتي على الضلالة, that to the Ummah itself. So when the Ummah itself agrees upon something, then that in itself, it's considered to be a sign of tawfiq, of divine grace, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has placed his stamp of approval on that particular judgment. Now for the Shi'a, it was different. For the Shi'a, I said, no, the Isma transfers from the Prophet to the Imams, to the infallible Imams. So to Ali ibn Abi Talib, and then Imam Hassan or Hussein, on down the line. So that was their particular view. And so this is part of the issue as well, that trying to establish some degree of certainty and normalcy with regard to the Islamic teachings as well. So, but again, there's disagreement about whether or not Ijmaa has actually truly ever occurred. And if anyone really wants to have a more detailed look at this, I actually had one of my a peer-reviewed essay that I did called the Scholarly Consensus Between Use and Misuse. You can find it either in the Journal of Islamic Law and Culture or on my website, Lamppost Productions website. You can find it there as well. And I get into all the nuances of the issue of consensus. So اتفاق كل أهل عصري على أي علماء الفقه دون نكري على اعتبار حكم أمر قد حدث شرعا كحرمة الصلاة بالحدث. Right. So their agreement has to be upon a certain type of issue. So an agreement on consideration of a decree occurring in relation to the Sharia. So that is to say that this particular hukum is a hukum shar'i, not a hukum lughawi. So you can't say linguists say, oh, well, the linguists, there's ijma'. So most of the linguists say this, and one says something different to the consensus. We say, well, yeah, you can just say, well, that's, a disagreement of language or understanding of language, not necessarily the area that we're focusing on, or matters of rational deliberation. So it has to be a ruling is a hukm shar'i, and also it is related to an event. It's related to an event. It's not just related to just an opinion that people have. So for instance, there is this opinion which is very popular amongst many scholars and the laity as well. And it's not to say that I don't sympathize with this particular view, but this view that it is an obligation upon lay people to follow one of the madhhabs, the four schools. Now that particular ruling itself is pretty much, it's not related to an event, right? That is simply an opinion that was developed, by scholars themselves. And so there are those who would object to that idea, because when you look in the books of Usul al-Fiqh, when they speak about the question of whether or not it's permissible to follow the judgments of a single scholar, right, in every issue, that they say it's jaiz. They say it's permissible. They don't say it's compulsory. They say it's permissible to do so if you want. So when you find there's a statement that the ammi laysa lahu madhhab, that the commoner has no madhhab, has no school. Madhhabuhu madhhabu muftihi, that his madhhab is the madhhab of his mufti. So whatever his mufti says is his madhhab or her madhhab. But it's understand it has to be an event, something that happened, which was not clarified in the Prophet's time. So this is why he mentions, like the prohibitions of prayers in a state of pollution or a state of ritual defilement. That is to say, making salat without wudu, right? An example of a particular, even though that was clarified during the Prophet's time, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, that is something that we can't do, but it's basically giving you that it's a particular fiqh of law, a praxis, that this is what is related to. Then he says, one may have recourse as a proof to consensus, as a proof of anyone within the ummah, not outside of it, because this ummah collectively has been given protection against error. So basically what this means is that the ijma', for instance, of the Christians, or the ijma' of the Jews, or the ijma' of the Buddhists really has no bearing, has no meaning, according to this particular belief or this particular opinion, that that their ijma' really is pointless, but ijma' of this ummah, That is really what really has meaning. And that's what is meant by this. Because it said the isma itself is not for them. We have the isma, not them, you see. So, again, part of this particular doctrine or this particular ideology or dogma. Then he says, كُلُّ إِجْمَاعٍ فَحُجَّةٌ عَلَى مَنْ بَعْدَهُ فِي كُلِّ عَصْرٍ إِقْبَالًا. Each consensus is a proof for those that come after it in every generation. So every, when, as mentioned before, if a consensus happens, then the people of that generation are obliged to adhere to it, and then the generation coming after it as well. But then he says, انقراض عصره لم يشترط أي في إنقاذه وقيل مشترط. The end of his generation was not made a condition. That is, its validity, in its validity, but has also been said that it is conditioned. So if we say that when Ijma occurs, that the generation which is present, the present generation has to follow it, and that the all generations after that generation have to follow it, there is a question that is raised by the scholars of, is it compulsory for, before the Ijma is considered to be binding, for all the people of one generation to die off, right, without there rising any person who objects to it, or do we simply, from the time we ascertain the Ijma, it becomes a consensus? Yeah. If that makes any sense. Well, put it like this. Scholars are alive. The living scholars, Mujtahideen, they offer their judgments, and we appropriate or acquire those judgments, and we assume on the basis of that there's a consensus now. But there's a younger person, who's alive at the time, and then it's not a mujtahid yet, but 2 years later becomes a mujtahid. And then when that person becomes a mujtahid, he or she differs with the opinion of most of the other scholars, right? So do we now say, well, Ijma hasn't occurred, right? Because all these people who are living, who had the same opinion, are still alive, but another mujtahid arises, and differs with it, so now we can't claim Ijma because of that. Or let's say, even in the absence of a new mujtahid, we say with all those who are living, let's say that they give this judgment, and a couple years later, one of the mujtahids decides, oh, actually, I was wrong. I don't agree with my earlier opinion. Like, for instance, Imam Shafi'i. Like, Imam Shafi'i, he has his madhhaab, qadim wa jadid, like some opinions he had when he was in one town, when he was in Syria, it's not the same when he was in Egypt. And so like he may change his opinion. So scholars may do so. Does a scholar have the right to change his opinion or her opinion after he or she exhausts study or apparently exhausts study and offers their opinion publicly? There's some say no, and others say, well, yeah, of course, they have the right to change their opinion. You see, so these are issues related to that. So the generation. So if the generation dies off with no one changing his or her opinion, then Ijma. Others say, well, no, we don't have to wait until the generation is over. Say from the time they all agree, Ijma has occurred, and even the scholar himself can't go against his previous opinion, right? According to that opinion. Others say, well, yes, he can go against his previous opinion because he follows his conscience. He has to follow his conscience and based upon his study, level of study. So that's fundamentally what that bait is referring to. Then he says, يَجُوزِ لِأَهْلِهِ أَنْ يَرْجِعُوا. I'm pretty certain that I probably should say لا يجوز لأهله أن يرجعوا إلا على الثاني فليس يمنعه. It is not possible for the people participating in a consensus to dissent from it. So this is what I just said. Except in the case of the second opinion, the opinion that says that you have to wait until the generation passes away, right? According to that opinion, the person has all that time to alter their view. Right. So once all of his peers die, then if if the view hasn't been offered, then there's an ijma. But if they haven't, but if he changes his opinion during that particular period, then there's no ijma. According to which it is not forbidden. So according to the second opinion, يعتبر عليه قول من ولد وصار مثله فقيه مجتهد. It is also to be considered as the opinion of someone born within the same age. and who became like them a faqih mujtahid. And this is what the issue I brought up as well is, do we give consideration to people who were born during that time and they rise up to the level of ijtihad before all of the mujtahideen die off, right? And then expresses an opinion that differs from theirs, you see. Do we have to wait, is that considered? Some say no, some say yes. يحصل إجماع بالأقوال من كل أهله وبالأفعال. Said the consensus results from the utterance of each of his members and from their actions. So with regard to the definitive, the explicit consensus, scholars say that the mujtahid, they all have to say what their view is, either through their words or their deeds. So for instance, if we see the scholars are different about a certain way of making salah, and then some of them say, that you can pray that way. Most of them said that, but others didn't say anything. But then you see them praying that way. They said, well, that's clear indication that's what they believe to be permissible. So they take that as the sign as well, a way to ascertain their opinion about the issue. Whereas there's another opinion that says, لا ينسب إلى ساكت قول, that you cannot attribute any statement to a person who is silent, to a silent person. A person doesn't speak, But one would argue that this is not silence. His actions is a sign, it's not a silence. It's a sign of what he or she believes to be permissible. وَقَوْلُ بَعْضٍ حَيْثُ بَاقِيهِمْ فَعَلْ وَبِانْتِشَارٍ مَعْ سُكُوتِهِمْ حَصَلْ. So the consensus results from the utterance of each of his members and from their actions, or the utterance by some in accordance with which others act. Or the spreading of either those utterances or acts combined with the silence of the others. So وَقَوْلُ بَعْضٍ حَيْثُ بَاقِيهِمْ فَعَلْ, right? So that's to say that the consensus also could be ascertained by the statement of some and the silence of other people. وَبِانْتِشَارٍ مَعْ سُكُوتِهِمْ حَصَلْ, or if the opinion of the other mujtahideen is sort of widespread to the extent that the silent mujtahid doesn't hear it, the silent mujtahid actually hears of it but doesn't say anything in objection to it, that in itself is a sign of consent, according to one view as well. And then and that's pretty much all he has to say about Ijmaa, but then he just has a very short, brief comment about what is called the principle or the source of law, the opinion of the Sahabi, قول الصحابي. Then he says, ثم الصحابي قوله عن مذهبه على الجديد فهو لا يحتج به. So then the opinion of the companion concerning his own practice, according to the later view of a Shafi'i, cannot be used as proof. Right, so the opinion of a Sahabi, is it authoritative? Right, so Imam Abu Hanifa's position, yes, it is authoritative. Even when the Sahaba differ, Imam Abu Hanifa's position was that you can take from any of them that you choose because of the hadith, even though most scholars say it's a weak hadith, and some say fabricated hadith, that the Sahabi kan nujum, my companions are like the stars. So any of them that you emulate, you are rightly guided. And so, but Imam Abu Hanifa accepted the soundness of that particular report. And so on that basis, when Sahaba differ about something that he himself feels it is legitimate to choose any of their views, he deems to be fit. According to Imam Shafi'i's, the later, right, the view that he died upon, that the statement of the Sahabi has no strength. It doesn't have a strength as long as other Sahaba are in disagreement with him. And then in another sense, by including this particular line or the line after as well in this section on Ijmaa, fundamentally, he's alluding to the very fact that their one opinion definition of Ijmaa, or one opinion said that Ijmaa only happened amongst the Sahaba. After the time of the Sahaba, there's no Ijmaa. So Ibn Hazm al-Zahiri, that was an opinion that he had, that it happened during the time of Ijmaa, then after that it never occurred. But then in another book he actually sort of contradicts that and said that that even for them it didn't occur. And many of the modern Usuli scholars like Abdul Karim Zaidan, Abdul Wahab Khalaf, Wahid al-Zuhairi, all of them are of the view that Ijmaa has never occurred. According to the Usuli definition of Ijmaa, it has never occurred in Islamic history. Rather, what we find in the time of the Sahaba is what we call the Ijmaa al-Shura, the sort of a conciliar judgment, a group sort of fatwa, where they sit down and do shura, they consult one another, and then they pass a judgment. And that in itself is not the same as ijma, according to this definition, where we find individual scholars working on their independently of one another, and then we ascertain their views afterwards. And so he's alluding to that by including this as well. وَفِي الْقَدِيمِ حُجَّةٌ لِمَا وَرَدْ فِي حَقِّهِمْ وَضَعَفُوهُ فَلْيُرَدْ. Whereas in accordance with his previous opinion, it is to be taken as proof, meaning the opinion of Shafi'i. So Shafi'i, in his earlier opinion, was that the statements of a Sahabi is authoritative, but in the one upon which he died, it was not authoritative. But it has been regarded as weak and rejected. That is to say, the opinion that says that the statements of Sahabi are authoritative. Okay, so with that, we will, inshallah, open up for any questions that you may have. Wa sallallahu ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam tasliman kathira. Right, exactly. You definitely cannot function with some type of consensus, Right, exactly. You can't function in an administrative situation. Consensus is extremely important especially for governors. That consensus and uniformity, standardization in the laws is extremely important for governors because it helps them, rule their societies with relative ease. You see, however, that when we exclude the possibility of dissenting opinions, right, simply because it's not what most people are saying, then we might be locking out a lot of significant benefit, from the community as well. You see, so you seem like you didn't finish your question. I'm sorry. Go ahead. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Right. Consensus and democracy. Well, see, democracy is about majority rule. You see, consensus means the agreement of every single person. Right. It's not majority. Now, in the Sunni tradition, that is fundamentally what ijma became as well. Even though the claims were always that this is everybody agrees with this, it's like, well, it can't be everybody because the Shi'a, they don't agree with it. So it's like, well, we don't care what the Shi'a have to say, right? You understand? We don't care what this group of Muslims have to say because they're people of batil, of falsehood, so their opinion doesn't have any meaning. And that's fundamentally the way it works in societies. You see, when you're talking about political sort of conditions. Right. Yeah, well, definitely. I mean, you can't. Well, with consensus, it's not an issue of even considering the idea that you might be wrong. See, because for the Sunnis, the idea of consensus is that you're right. That you have uncovered the divine intent, right? That when everybody's saying the same thing, that in itself is a sign, taken as a sign that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has blessed or guided your decision, and so like we have hadith like, inna yadullah ma'al jama'ah, Alaikum bi jama'ah, fa inna yadullah ma'al jama'ah, that you must cling to the collective because verily God's hand is with the collective. Last shami'u ummati ala khata, that my ummah will not unite on an error. Even though almost all those hadiths like that mention, they're all weak, according to the scholars of hadith, but Sunnis still have appropriated them and made them a basis for the concept of ijma. So it was something that developed later in Islamic history. It wasn't something articulated by the Prophet ﷺ, because the early commentators on those hadiths, they didn't interpret it as meaning, the agreement of the scholars or the agreement of the people about an opinion about an issue. The way that they took those hadiths is that what it means is that in no time in Islamic history will there ever be a time where every single Muslim will be doing wrong. There are always going to be some Muslims doing right. There's always going to be some Muslims doing it right. There's never going to be any time in any generation where every single Muslim is going to be upon error and sin and among misguidance. You see, that's the way the early commentators on those hadiths where they took it. But then later commentators added to the understanding of hadith this idea that those hadiths mean that if Muslims agree upon, or the majority of Muslims agree upon something, then it is a sign that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala agrees with them. You see, agrees with them. So go ahead, Aisha. Right. So the question was the point of having ijma if ijma never really happened. Well, the point of having ijma, again, and the way that it's been utilized is a way to maintain a semblance of simplicity and order in Muslim society. It has its uses, you see. It has its uses, but most of it is civic. The greatest benefit is, in terms of like civic sort of interaction and sort of political interaction with people. So for instance, now Muslims themselves, growing up in Muslim societies, they have an idea about what Islam really is. You see, and so it's like, listen, I don't have to, do it all myself and try to research it and things like that. But the reality is just simply that almost every single claim of ijma, it can be qualified as being either the ijma of the majority of the Muslims, or the ijma of the Sunnis only, or the ijma of the four schools, right? Or the ijma, which means the cases where the scholar didn't know if there's any disagreement about it, in spite of his apprehension about the possibility of there being someone who disagreed with it. You call, in the case of la yu'rafu fi khilaf, like Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal mentioned. So this is what you find. Or when they talk about the ijma of the Sahaba, they're not talking about the Mujtahideen from the Sahaba, doing individually going out and deciding that we're going to research this issue and then try to determine what Allah's view is on the issue. Rather, it was done in a collective fashion, that they would get together, issue come up, war, things like that. What should we do? What is the guidance of the Prophet? And they would take consultation, and then the Khalifa or the commander would just make a decision on the basis of what he deemed to be correct based upon that consultation. It's like you'll find in the books, they'll say that an example of ijma in the time of the Sahaba is the election of Abu Bakr as-Siddiq. However, Abu Bakr's election was disputed. It wasn't. All the Sahaba did not agree with that. Asad ibn Ubadah didn't agree with it. He was hoping to be the Khalifa, but he was sort of, he left Mecca after that. You see, that Ali ibn Abi Talib and Zubair ibn Awam, they didn't come forward to give him bay'ah right away. They felt, in books mentioned, they felt offended by that they weren't included in the nomination or the possibility of being elected at first. They did give him bay'ah afterwards, but it wasn't an issue of like, okay, and Mu'adh bin Jabal wasn't there at the time as well, and he was one of the Mujtahideen. We know he was one of the students of the Prophet ﷺ. He was in Yemen at the time, so the Mujtahideen during the time weren't available to actually approve of that. Now, so you find examples. So their judgments were based upon shura, or based upon majority sort of collective decision making process. And where ijma, according to the definition of Usuliyin, is the agreement of all the mujtahideen in an era after the era of the Prophet on a judgment related to an occurrence, and so, which means every person is working on his own to come up with reach the right conclusion. And then it just so happens at the end, so, oh man, they all agree, mashallah, that's a sign of tawfiq. All of them agreed, and they didn't sort of copy one another. It wasn't like cut and paste. It's like everybody, did his utmost to try to come to the same conclusion, and then they did that. But said, did that occur? No, it did not happen. It did not happen historically. And so now, what I think an important question from this is that, okay, if ijma didn't occur, it's better than like, what's the point of ijma, is like, if ijma didn't occur, is that how do we know what the bedrock teachings of Islam are? You see, you understand? That's really, I think, a more important issue, is that because often when the scholars talk about something being a point of ijma, they actually don't mean it in the way that the scholars of Usul al-Fiqh mean it. So when you're talking about theology, they'll say this is a point of ijma, of consensus, and it'll be a point of theology. It won't be a point of fiqh or usul al-fiqh. That what they mean, or sometimes it may be a point of fiqh as well, But for instance, like the obligation of praying 5 times a day, the fact that illicit intercourse is haram, things like that. There's points of ijma, But how do we ascertain those ideas? Like when he mentioned, he said the praying with the impermissibility of praying without wudu, without ritual purity. It's like, well, that itself is a point of ijma, but not in the same way that one would claim that you have to have niyyah, or, well, niyyah is probably, because it's not even a point of ijma between the madhhaab in every issue. But like, let's say, the obligation of saying Allahu Akbar, right? In the salat, takbir ihram, the first takbir, and tasneem at the end. That's the point of ijma between the madhhaab of Islam, you see. But that wasn't something that was articulated during the Prophet's time, but something articulated during the Prophet's time was that you cannot pray without tahur, that you cannot do so. So with those type of teachings, which we call teachings or that are based upon consensus, we refer to them as al-ma'lum min ad-din bid-durura, matters that are known by immediate necessity to be from the religion itself. The bedrock teachings of Islam. Now, the source of those teachings is not legal deliberations, right? It's not sort of thing I'm studying. No, the source of those teachings, the bedrock teachings of Islam, is naql, is transmission. You understand? We know this is from Islam because it was related from the time of the Prophet ﷺ. That's why we know it's from Islam, you see. So often you find in the books, the scholars will say this is a point of ijma', but really what they're talking about is something which was transmitted from the early period, from the Prophet himself, or from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, as being something which we cannot negotiate, and one of the non-negotiable issues of the Islamic teachings, you see. Whereas ijma' in this case is talking about the result of interpretation, the interpretative process, use of qiyas, among other things, in order to arrive at a conclusion based upon some type of text to begin with, you see. So does that clear it up a little bit? Yeah. Right. What it means by the end of a generation in line 139 is when everybody dies off. Right, all the peers, all the Mujtahideen who are peers in one generation, when all of them die off. Right? No, it's just when everybody's dead, pretty much. So. Right, yeah. So when the new generation come in and joins the old generation of Mujtahideen, then according to one opinion, then their opinions have to be given consideration to. The opinion that says you have to wait for the generation to pass says that the new Mujtahideen is part of that generation now. You see, so. The other opinion is that, well, no, the new mujtahid is not part of that generation. So whatever they've already agreed upon, the new mujtahid can't reopen up that file once again. You see, yeah, according to the second opinion. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yes.
Okay, you have about 4 questions online. We'll see which ones we can get to. Mm-hmm. First up is from Fizza, who asks, "What about ijtihad? What about creative thinking in this age that might lead to questions that need a consensus to answer? With different sects, how will all scholars express?"
Right, so new issues in this age which require creative thinking. Like an example, did she provide an example of like what she's talking about? Because some issues may not be a matter which requires some type of ijtihad, usuli, you understand what I'm saying? I mean, there's a certain type of ijtihad that every person has a qualification to do, or at least can learn, even common Muslims. Like, for instance, how to determine the times of prayer, the direction of the qibla. Those are things that are not the specific realm of scholars, that common Muslims can become the authorities on those type of issues, you see, and it's easy to do so, and so, but other things that are a bit more complex, this is what we're talking about, and trying to derive the rulings of the laws that potentially may be in conformity with the divine knowledge,
So perhaps if there is a new kind of novel situation that arises, mm-hmm. especially potentially in the area of science and mm-hmm. medicine and things like that,
right? Yeah,
I think maybe they're getting at is there like a current contemporary body that would kind of move to address these issues with some type of authority?
Yeah, I mean there are bodies in different parts of the Muslim world. There's in Europe, there's the Muslim Fiqh Council there. We have our fiqh councils here in the United States. You have, in the Muslim country, you have their own sort of majalis, their assemblies, their scholastic assemblies, and they've been moving more and more towards fatwa of shura, that this is what a lot of people do. They do it on the basis of just sort of conciliar, collective deliberations as opposed to individual type of judgments. And this has been sort of the preferred way of doing things during this age by many of our scholars. However, that doesn't negate the right of certain individuals to actually to try to work on certain issues that arise from time to time, and if those people have the requisite qualification to do so. So I mean, you have like in science, a lot of issues that come up, like organ donation, and I mean, so there are many scholars who write about these different things. They give different fatwas, about the issue of like we call test tube babies and things. I forgot the more appropriate terms of surrogate, mothers and things like that. Which is a very, very difficult issue. I mean, issues like financial transactions today. Are they Islamic or un-Islamic? What makes them un-Islamic? So there's a lot of ijtihad that has been happening. Even when it comes to the issue of the Islamic calendar, every single year, it's like we have these debates. But a lot of those debates are rooted in new type of ideas of ijtihad. So a lot of the opinions that come about, they're related to. They actually are not really appropriating classical sort of ideas about how to approach those issues, you see. So people are just not calling it ijtihad, but there's a whole lot of it occurring. And it's like, I remember Sheikh Muhammad Taqweel said once in the lesson we were having in Fez, in the Qarwiyyin Masjid, and one of the students had asked if there were any Mujtahideen in the world today. And so he said, لا يخلو العصر لا يخلو الزمان من دعوى الاجتهاد. He said that no time is free of the claim of ijtihad. Right. So that's what he said. And the Shi'a are different in this issue. The Shi'a said that there's always Mujtahideen. For them, it's like you have to follow the living Mujtahideen. So they have their own people. They highlight them. They say, these are Mujtahids, we follow them. Well, the Sunnis have been a little bit less sort of open to that idea historically. But there are definitely a lot of Sunnis who don't really pay any attention to that tradition altogether. Yeah. All right. Was there another? Yeah.
Let me just actually combine a couple of these. So Khensa asks, what about the documents or documentation of Ijmaa? Is there a compilation of them that can be accessed? And how many scholars would be deemed appropriate to contend the Ijmaa?
Those are good questions. I mean, one, there are a number of books that have been written which have collected a number of claims of Ijmaa. I mean, Nawawi has a work, Ibn Mundhir has a work on the issue of areas of Ijmaa. Ibn Hazm al-Zahiri as well has a book called Maratib al-Ijmaa, but then you also have to read that along with Ibn Taymiyyah's critique of it called Naqdu Maratib al-Ijmaa. So there are a number of books which have attempted to collect a number of points, areas where there's consensus, but many of those areas are disputed, if not most of them are disputed, even to the point that even the scholar, 11th century scholar Abu Ishaq Isfaraini claimed that there are 20,000 areas of consensus, and he said that, and then some of the more contemporary scholars like Wahbat al-Zuhayli had mentioned that, well, these are claims, and they have to be verified claim, so the claim that you just felt that this outrageous number of areas of consensus that exists. And as I mentioned before, that there is more reason to there's more proof that the Ijmaa has not happened than Ijmaa has occurred, but the claims themselves they're all qualified. Those claims are either the Ijmaa of the Sunnis or the Ijmaa of the four schools, and sometimes the Ijmaa of the Mujtahideen of a single madhhaab. And then the other question about how many Mujtahideen are required, there's a disagreement about that. That there's some who say that one Mujtahid is enough, but then others, they raise it up to the level of tawatur, it's like a number where, it removes doubt that they came together and conspired upon truth. Some make it a number lower than that. So there's no Ijmaa on Ijmaa. There's no Ijmaa on the definition of Ijmaa and the tenets of Ijmaa. There's no Ijmaa there, but of course we have popular definitions. And even the earliest definitions of Ijmaa, did not make a distinction between a Sunni and Shia. Because you notice even the definition which is offered by Abdul Wahab Khalaf, he's actually trying to borrow from earlier writings, you know, and in it he said the agreement of all the Muslims, the Mujtahideen from the Muslims. He didn't say the Sunnis only, but as time went on, there's more the sectarianism was built up more and more between the different Muslim groups. The Sunnis they would say, well, these people, his هذا قوله لا يعتد به, you know, that his opinion means nothing. And these are people fully qualified to do ijtihad, but because they members of a different sect of Islam, they would be ignored, you see. Where the earlier scholars like Juwayni, Imam Ghazali, you don't find them including or having that type of bias, you know, when they speak about the issue of Ijmaa. Mm-hmm. Yes, inshallah. Yeah, I know time is going to went by, but mashallah.
So the question is, so from what I understand is that you don't necessarily have to follow a madhhab, although it is recommended. And if you do follow a madhhab, would it be okay if a circumstance arises to use another because of a hardship? Number two, does the amman message reach the level of ijma'? And if not, what authority, if any, does a non-consensus opinion have?
Right. Okay, so I mean, those are good questions, you know, and we're going to end on those two. The first one, the first question was, what was the first question again? I know the second was about the amman message. The first one was
the first one was, so from what I understand is that you
the madhhab issue, right? You know, not following the madhhab, and whether or not it's compulsory, and if you could abandon the madhhab because of hardship. Some of the madhabs or some opinions in some of the madhabs, they definitely allow for a person following one school to actually abandon the school because of a hardship, you know, because a certain hardship. Like for instance, we find some of the Shafi'is who will, when it comes to the matter of breaking one's ablution when you touch, you know, a female. For instance, you get on the bus and sort of they rub up against you, or you rub against them, you know, accidentally, something like that. That, you know, generally the teaching is that it breaks your wudu. You know, but the Malikis, it doesn't. It only breaks your wudu if, you know, you intend some pleasure from it, or if you experience it, you know, from it, you know. But if as long as there's no experience or an intention to experience pleasure from the touch of another person, then it doesn't break your wudu. So some of the Shafi'is are the view that it's okay to leave their school, you know, and take the position of the Maliki school on that issue. You know, that generally you find when people teach the adherence to the school, they'll teach you that it's not permissible for you to leave your school because of a hardship. Because of a hardship that you experience from a ruling in your school. Rather, you can do it if the ruling in the other school is harder, it's more difficult, but not if it's easier. You find that. And in Sufi circles, you actually find the scholars actually emphasize the importance of, you know, of you taking the harder position. You know, so if you follow one school and you're in the position and your school is actually easier than the one in the other school, you can just leave your school and then take the position of the other school, because this is suluk now. You know, it's about challenging the nafs, you know, to taking the harder position. You know, so the issue of whether or not it's permissible to we call tatabbu' rukhas, or do talfiq, sort of legal eclecticism, this is a point of disagreement, that scholars don't agree upon those issues. It's not a black or white issue, as many people often sort of try to make it out to be. It's not a black or white issue, you know, but I would definitely, consistency is definitely important for a sort of, I guess you would say, behavioral sort of consistency as well, you know, and sincerity, matters of sincerity. So if you adopt something, you try your best to adhere to it as good as possible, as strict as possible, I would say, and only abandon it if it's you seem almost impossible to do so. Then the second question about the amman message, about whether or not it reaches a point of consensus, clearly it does not reach the point of consensus, because there are many people who object to the amman message, especially the people who are very hardline, hardcore, or it's called die-hard madhhabi people. You know, that many of them they believe that, especially the Sunnis, it's like they believe that, listen, that the only thing that's valid is following the four schools. This is what constitutes true Islam, is following the four schools. And the Sunnis are the people of haqq, And so, and I'm not sure if any Shia object to the Amman message either. I would imagine there may be some as well, but the Amman message is extremely unprecedented in Islamic history and very amazing. It's a very amazing development, in Islamic history, that you find, these different sects of Islam, Sunnis and Shia, acknowledging one another's Islam. Even though historically the Shia position has been that Sunnis are not Muslims because they don't believe in the Imam, but to find that things change in that regard, and then also instead of saying 4 madhhabs, saying 8 are valid as well. That this extremely unprecedented. So it's like the Ibadi is valid, the Shia, the 12-word madhhab is valid, and among other things, basically saying that anyone who adheres to one of these 8 schools, then you are a Muslim, a real Muslim, that your Islam is valid. It's not necessarily to say that the school, the madhhab of the law itself in those schools is valid, but rather that if you're following any of these things, then you're following a form of Islam, an acceptable form of Islam. That is, what the issue is. So unless there is unanimous agreement, then it's consensus. But if there's no unanimous agreement, and I know, and there's some of my friends, I know they didn't like the Amman message, and I had to speak to people about it, and so there is definitely not a matter of consensus, but it is a significant, extremely significant thing that has occurred in Islamic history in today's time, and I do think that it does have value. And so I think that that's probably all we can say about it for right now. We've gone way over time, and the next session should be starting very soon. So appreciate everyone tuning in, and those of you who come out to attend in person. And inshallah, look forward to future sessions, just as exciting, inshallah. And but I think most importantly, what's understand is that the way that we establish the bedrock teachings of Islam, the non-negotiable teachings of Islam, is through transmission, right? And the other things are, again, these sort of appendages or sort of things that are added to Islam later on, based upon legal deduction, and people are free to accept those issues as well. But understanding that almost every claim of Ijmaa, in the sense of the Usuli definition of Ijmaa, is nothing more than a majoritarian claim, either a claim, of Sunni Ijmaa or 4-school Ijmaa, or a claim of when a scholar doesn't know that anyone differs with people he knows, but not that he actually gone out and did the research and questioned everybody was necessary to question on the issue, and then also the sects which considered to be deviant were excluded from consideration to even begin with. So it's not Ijma' Ummah, the type of Ijma' which is binding on the Ummah, and if we reject it, we consider according to Sunnis, we would be considered apostate for rejecting it, is the Ijma' of the Ummah, right? And so the claims of Ijma' by those scholars that have these books is not Ijma' of the Ummah, So we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to guide us and grant mercy upon us. Wa sallallahu alayhi Sayyidina Muhammad wa alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam. Asalaamu Alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Wanted to give you some shout outs here. We had students joining us from the UK, India, the Bay Area, other parts of California, Chicago, Istanbul, Malaysia,
MashaAllah.
Denmark, and Abdul Kareem from Philadelphia, Mashtakuba, home of the Sheikh.
MashaAllah. Assalamu alaikum to all of you. Inshallah, I appreciate you tuning in. Inshallah, see you